I think that some elements in my story speak of providential design in ways that are a little bit more expected if Christianity is true than they are if atheism is true.
There are lots of things in life that happen that really are merely coincidental.
I went online and ordered Graham's book, Is There a God? And 26 minutes later, I had an invitation in my mailbox to debate Graham Oppy on the existence of God and related questions.
There you go. God using your book to prove his existence. So what do you do with that, Graham? Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Big Conversation Season 4, brought to you in partnership with John Templeton Foundation. I'd love to know what you think of Graham Oppy and Guillaume Bignon's dialogue by filling out a brief survey. It's multi-choice and really quick. We've also got a bonus ebook to send you. Bishop Robert Barron and cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor debating God and atheism. You'll receive it when you register for our newsletter, plus you'll get updates and more bonus content from the Big Conversation. For the survey and to sign up, see the links with today's video and at our website, thebigconversation.show. Hello and welcome to The Big Conversation from Premier Unbelievable in partnership with John Templeton Foundation. I'm Justin Briley, bringing you another conversation with two big thinkers. I'm joined by Guillaume Bignon and Graham Oppy to discuss rationality, religious experience and the case for God. Guillaume Bignon is a Christian philosopher who experienced an adult conversion to Christianity as an atheist living in Paris. He tells the story in his recent book, Confessions of a French Atheist, How God Hijacked My Quest to Disprove the Christian Faith. And he draws out lessons from both philosophy, science, history and his own experience to make the case for Christianity. Graham Oppy is a leading atheist philosopher of religion at Monash University in Australia. He's one of the most significant voices in the world on arguments for and against God. And among his many books, there's the recent title, Is There a God? A Debate, written with Kenneth Pearce, which, among other things, discusses whether religious experience can count as evidence for the existence of God. So we're going to be very much discussing the role of religious experience today as we hear Guillaume's conversion story and whether it's reasonable to believe in God in the 21st century. So Guillaume and Graham, welcome along to the show. Graham, let's start with you as a newcomer to the show. And just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became interested firstly in the philosophy of religion. What led you down that particular path?
Okay, so I'll go back a fair way. My family are Australian Methodists. I was brought up as a Methodist. When I was about 13, I thought about things for a period, 6 weeks or so, and came down on the side of thinking that actually there wasn't a God and the things that I was being taught in Sunday school and hearing about at church were false. And during my high school years, I spent lots of time arguing with people about religion, the value of religion, about God and so on. When I went off to university, I studied science and the arts. So I did a major in maths, minor in physics, and then a major in philosophy and minor in history and philosophy of science. I was interested in philosophy of religion, but it wasn't much taught. And in fact, by the time I got to the end of graduate school, I hardly really thought about philosophy of religion at all. And I was thinking that I would end up working mainly in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. But when I came back to Australia after I finished my graduate school training, I was offered some casual teaching to teach a course in philosophy of religion. And I started, and I read stuff in philosophy of religion, and it resulted in some publications. I then applied for a research grant and for a project to write about reformed epistemology, and I ended up writing a book about ontological arguments, and that kind of set the direction of my career. So I think it's accidental that I became a philosopher of religion. It could easily have gone very differently.
I'm tempted to ask, do you think of all things as accidental on your worldview in that sense? Where do you kind of put yourself in terms of a label, atheist, agnostic, something else?
Okay, so this is something that changed over time. So I describe myself as an agnostic in the first part of my career. In the same kind of sense, or the same kind of way in which Bertrand Russell tended to describe himself as an agnostic. It was a kind of thought about certainty, or how confident you should be. I've come to think that way of thinking about the distinction between atheism and agnosticism is wrong. So I now call myself an atheist, but it's not that the position has changed. It's just the way that I think about the label has changed.
Interesting. Well, maybe we'll come back to that in some form. It's great to have you on the show today, and really looking forward to this discussion with Guillaume. I know you've read his book, so you'll be interested, I'm sure, to interact with him on his story. Guillaume, it's great to know that you've been able to put this story down in writing, because I had you on several years ago on the show to talk about it, but you've gone in leaps and bounds in your academic career since then, and a lot more time to reflect on it. But for those who haven't heard it, maybe could you give us a sort of potted account, some of the highlights of your story? What made a young French atheist decide to become a Christian in the end?
Yes, sure. I'll be happy to. I suppose I'm a little bit the speaker and the subject or the object here if we are going to be discussing religious experience. So I will not hit the entire story, right? It's told in the book, and I won't spoil it for the listener either. But I'll try to hit some of the milestones that are important to discuss the religious experience itself with Graham. And then I'm looking forward to hearing whether I've done a big mistake in light of this story and experiences. So I grew up in France. I grew up in the Catholic Church, but it was not very passionate. It was not a very sincere engagement in the church. And as soon as I was old enough to tell my parents that I didn't really believe any of it, I simply stopped going to church, and my life was not very different. So I was an atheist from that point on. I affirmed that there was no God, but my life was not all that different. There was just no longer going to church. And as I grew and became a young adult, I was basically seeking my own happiness in a number of avenues. So I was playing volleyball, ended up playing in National League and having lots of fun in pursuing that. I was also playing music. I was playing the keyboard in a rock band, so enjoying that pursuit as well in the arts, to play as a band, do concerts, and just enjoy this. And then I studied math, physics, and engineering science, and headed towards an engineering degree to be a software engineer, which I thought would provide well for a life well lived and enjoyed. And I also, at that time, one of my interests was women. As a French atheist my age, in the French culture, this is one big, important part of life. And I was starting to pursue women and to have relationships as one of the big goals to make me happy and satisfied as well. And in this very secular context in France, the likelihood of me hearing the Gospels were not extremely high. And so through a set of very improbable events, I ended up going on a vacation to the Caribbean. And then I went hitchhiking to come back from the beach to the house there one day. And then randomly a car of American tourists stopped. They were not even stopping to pick us up, but to ask for directions. And they were headed back to their hotel, and they didn't know where it was. And so actually, it turns out that the hotel was next door to where we were going. So they picked us up to show direction. And one of them was an American, a former model and actress, and was immediately attracted. So tried to seduce, to talk. Long story short, we ended up in a relationship in the Caribbean. And I discovered that she was a professing Christian, which I thought was an intellectual suicide at the time. I had no patience for belief in God or any religious practice. I certainly didn't want any of this for myself. And also, she had a view of morality that meant that she believed in abstinence before marriage, which was a huge deal breaker for me as well. So big problems associated with her religious beliefs. Nevertheless, she was exotic and attractive enough that I really decided to try to pursue this, and that the problems would take care of themselves, I thought. So I went back to Paris. She flew back to New York, which is where she lived. And I started to think about religion and God, so as to be able to tell her that she should stop this and that we should be happy together. At which point I started to pick up the New Testament to try to understand a little bit what she actually believes, and started to read the Bible as an adult, and discovered that it tasted a bit different. I discovered the person of Jesus and found him to be really interesting and captivating. As I was going to be starting to think about Christianity and consider the truth claim, I figured there was also one experiment I should do, which was to pray as an unbeliever. And so I said, well, if there's a God out there, I'm looking into this now, so that must be interesting. Why don't you go ahead and reveal yourself to me? But so I just started to consider those claims, but I couldn't even have ended up in church to visit, even if I had wanted to, because at the time I was playing volleyball, and so every weekend I was traveling around the country to play the volleyball game. And then there's shortly after I prayed that unbelieving prayer, there was an unexplained shoulder injury on my shoulder that I used to spike on the dominant arm, which meant that I could not play volleyball, and I was off of volleyball courts for a few weeks. And so I went to a church, to visit a church, to see what those Christians do when they get together, which was a very strange experience. I was very awkward because I thought that even just investigating or even being present in the church was already an intellectual crime. And so I felt very awkward. I sat down and listened to the...
Were you kind of like seeing them almost as animals in the zoo to be kind of examined in this sort of psychological experiment?
That is the way I describe it, really, like you went to the zoo, because to me, I had never seen what she seems to be, which was a genuine Christian who believes that there is a God and that it makes a huge difference in life. So to see all of these people gathered and praying, and they prayed like there was actually a God listening to their prayers, very, very strange to me. And so I sat down, listened to the sermon. I don't remember the thing that the preacher said, but then I thought, okay, I've seen enough. I need to escape. And so I jumped on my feet, ran out the back door. And as I had I opened the door to escape, and as I had one foot out the door, there's a big blast of chills that started in my stomach and went up in my chest and grabbed me by the throat. And I was frozen on the doorstep, and I heard myself thinking, this is ridiculous. I need to figure this out. And so I was stopped in my track. I turned around and I went straight to the head pastor and introduced myself. And he was amused to meet me. And he was very happy to discuss his beliefs and practices. And so we made an appointment. And so this pastor, his first name is Robert, we ended up having this discussions and relationship that for a number of months I would come back and we would talk about some of the big practices and beliefs of the Christian faith, a bit of challenges, thinking, and through those conversations over a period of time, my thinking shifted on a number of intellectual points, and we can maybe dive into some of those afterwards, but some of the hurdles, some of the barriers that I had against belief in God came crumbling down. I thought that you needed to be absolutely stupid to believe in God, and that came crumbling down when I just met very sensible, intelligent people who believed this. I had a very strong fear that the Christian view of ethics was repressive and intolerant, and he was able to paint a much better picture and more attractive view of ethics and relationships. I thought that science disproved God, that there was an open war between science and faith. And so I also reflected and was able to see that there was no strong objection against the existence of God based purely on my scientific knowledge. And then I also naively expected that if I was going to know that God exists, then I would need to have scientific proof of that. I expected knowledge to come from science. And I thought also that to know that God exists, you needed to be absolutely certain. So all of those things came crumbling down when I reflected a bit on it and in my discussions with Robert. And on the positive side, I also came to appreciate the teachings of the New Testament. I saw them as historical records of what allegedly happened to Jesus. And so I was challenged to think about, like, what if this is actually the true account of what transpired in the life of Jesus. So the intellectual shifts are along those lines, and we can get back to that.
Yeah, and up to this point, it's been quite an intellectual journey, though you have had that rather interesting experience in the church. But as I understand it, your faith didn't really come to life in that sense, or you didn't kind of cross the line until you had quite an interesting experience that kind of went alongside that intellectual journey.
Yeah, that's right. So the intellectual barriers were removed, and so the mind somewhat gave the permission to the heart, but to me there was still a huge missing piece, and that came in reflecting on the message of the Christian faith that I discovered in reading the New Testament, and that Pastor Robert had given me a little booklet that was kind of working you through the basics of the Christian faith, and I was writing down my questions and coming back to him with my notes, and one question came back over and over again in my notes, and it was, why did Jesus have to die? I just didn't understand intellectually what was the connection between Jesus dying on the cross 2,000 years ago and my life as a Christian if I were to become one. And in the midst of this questioning and reflections, I also, my unbelieving prayer life had shifted to, hey, what if it's true? Well, God, if you're out there, then I'm going to need you to reveal yourself to me very more explicitly. And the way I describe it is that I was hoping for some sort of an open heaven with the rays of light coming down from the sky and a voice telling me, welcome, son. And what God did instead is that he reactivated my conscience. And so I realized that there was something really immoral that I had committed in the weeks prior to that I had lied to everybody and to myself to hide it and suppress it. And then through this time, God shoved it in my face, and I was afflicted with guilt. It was a very real, powerful experience of just realizing, no, I'm not a good person. I've done this. There's no coming back. There's no erasing it. And in that place of pain out of the guilt, the message that I had been reading about finally clicked, made sense, and I realized, okay, well, that's why Jesus had to die. Me. And so I came to understand that Christian message that Jesus paid the price for our sins and that we can be forgiven and have eternal life, not because we're good, because I wasn't, but because of our faith in Christ, where we benefit from his sacrifice on our behalf. So that message hit me like a ton of brick. I accepted it. Trusted Jesus for my salvation, and the guilt evaporated, and I experienced a spiritual rebirth. So that's at that time. I'm going to skip the details on how then I ended up in the U.S., but I ended up moving to the United States, later on did I end up reflecting more on those things, studying more, ended up in seminary, got a master's in New Testament studies, and later on a PhD in philosophical theology. So that's how you get to unbelief in France.
Well, yeah, there's a whole lot more to that story, obviously, that could be told. But you've given us a really helpful sketch of the journey that you went on, and it's a very interesting one, and really helpful, I think, just to spend some time framing this discussion, because I think there'll be various elements of your story that'll be interesting to draw out with Graham. Graham, I don't know how often you bump into these kinds of stories. You're obviously a philosopher of religion. How often do you kind of encounter people with these, well, intellectual journeys, but also these quite, interesting religious experiences? And what do you make of Guillaume's?
Okay, can I say one thing, just in kind of general response to the story that we just heard and then maybe you can ask me that question again. So it seems to me that Guillaume's experience as an atheist was very different from mine. So from the time that I became an atheist, I had lots of friends who were Christian theists. I had friends that belonged to other religions as well. And over the course of my career, I've supervised PhDs by Catholic priests. I've supervised PhDs by other people who are Christians. Throughout my life, I've had interactions with Christians, and I never thought that being a religious believer, being a Christian, or being some other kind, being a Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, was irrational or crazy or anything like that. And that's a really important difference between my experience of being an atheist and Guillaume's, I think, at least the way that it's presented in the book. So I just wanted to say that at the beginning.
Yeah, no, and that's a helpful distinction, because one thing I know about you, Graham, is you're very generous and open and someone who doesn't simply dismiss people because they're religious. Now, obviously there is that type of atheist out there, and on the internet especially. So it's interesting that obviously, though, your experience as an atheist was very different in that respect. I mean, when it comes to Guillaume's own story, where do you begin in terms of a response to that, in terms of sort of, I guess you're happy that he got to a place where he was obviously felt happy and more, flourishing and so on in his own life. I guess you just, wouldn't see that necessarily that points to the idea that there is ultimately a God behind it.
So part of the thing here is that there are plenty of stories that go both ways. I mean, Guillaume's story is quite familiar. There are lots of people who are living a life where they're kind of unsatisfactory. They've come to feel dissatisfied with their values, and they're not really finding meaning in what they're doing, and so on. And then there's this transition, and they end up in a place that seems much better. They feel like they've got values that fit to them. They find meaning in their life, and so on. But these stories go both ways. I mean, as we know, in the West, there's been a bit of a drift away from Christianity. There are lots of people who have stories like Guillaume's that run in reverse. And that's going to be a kind of question about the kind of evidential value of the story. That's not to cast any aspersions on people who go either way, right? It's just that when you're thinking about what's the total evidence here, there are stories in both directions. So it's not clear that the kind of existence of the stories is going to cut much ice one way or the other, right? But the point that you made, that it's good to end up in a place where you're comfortable with your values and everything. So I think that's right up to a point. I mean, I also kind of like the idea that, you never really settle, that there's always kind of, you can always improve, right? And so you don't want it to turn into complacency. But on the other hand, you don't want to be kind of torn apart by dissatisfaction, thinking that your life's meaningless, that the values that you've got were kind of ones you don't really want to avow anymore, and so on.
Yeah. But it doesn't sound in your story, Guillaume, that you were exactly... I think you were quite happy with your life up to that point. I don't think you were in some kind of existential despair and looking for purpose in life. It doesn't sound like that was the kind of person you were when these set of events suddenly transpired.
Yeah, so those events did bring me to this place of crisis, at least morally, with the reactivation of my conscience and the guilt that was associated with that. Prior to those, certainly no, I was very happy and enjoying my life very much. There was one moment of questioning existentially, wondering like, what is this? Like, what's the point of all of this? At the point where I was starting to be successful enough in all of those avenues that I felt like, I was the dog who caught the car, and then now what? So there was a bit of questioning there, but I quickly moved on and didn't really retain much of a reflection about whether God is necessary to have a good meaning for human lives or any such question. That was more in passing. As far as the experiences and going both ways, I guess it's the sheer existence of a person who changes their mind is not itself a very strong evidence or a testimony. I'm hoping that, obviously my story, I have no pretension that my story should be this knockdown argument, like, you've heard my story, you should be a Christian, and if you're still an atheist, this is crazy of you not to continue to resist. But I do hope that my story has a little bit more weight than just simply saying, well, some person changed their minds. I think that some elements in my story speak of providential design in ways that are a little bit more expected if Christianity is true than they are if atheism is true, particularly some of the unexpected experiences, some of the very improbable events that seem to drive in the direction, with the improbable hitchhiking, the improbable address of the hotel being next door to ours, and then that experience coming out of the church when I was trying to escape. So those improbabilities in the story that kind of speak to a grand design, I think speak a little bit more than just, hey, there's this guy, he changed his mind, so therefore you should do the same.
So I guess I wasn't thinking, I was actually thinking about specific examples. So think about Anthony Kenny, who's a very well-known philosopher. He was ordained as a Catholic priest. He spent about 5 years as a curate. And then he became an agnostic over a period of time, and he's remained as an agnostic ever since. And he gives a very, he's written a couple of autobiographies that give accounts of what happened to him and what happened to his beliefs. It's not like, there aren't really very interesting stories on the other side, right, with details. On the specific point about the kind of improbabilities, and this goes back to the thing that Justin said right at the beginning, there are lots of things in life that happen that really are merely coincidental, right? And there's no problem thinking there are 7 billion people on the planet. There are these scripts The conversion script is a very familiar script in our culture. It's not at all surprising that there are lots of people who fall into it, and when they fall into it, there are certain coincidences along the way, right? So from the point of view of someone who thinks that's a nice story, but I don't think that there's anything kind of supernatural that sits behind it, that's the kind of response that they're most likely going to give. That's not to impugn you for taking a different view about it, especially because it's your experience, right? But that's what I think a kind of response is likely to be.
Yeah, and so from your point of view, that the more rational way of looking at Guillaume's story is that these coincidences were coincidences; they weren't divinely ordained, and so on. I mean, why then, Guillaume? You know, I'm sure you've met this kind of objection before. Why for you should we take your interesting, specifics of your story as perhaps being more than just, the outworking of what happens when 7 billion people on the planet, interesting things happen,
I mean, I don't know that I have an argument to give you for why you should believe that this is the way that it should be interpreted. I think that it's more of an experience that it seems very interesting to see those seemingly providential improbabilities, and they spoke directly to my existential situation as well. So it was a mix of the intellectual reasons, the barriers falling down, being challenged with the historical data about the New Testament, and the overall grand story with those improbable experiences that together made for a explosive the conversion story. I think that's perhaps one place where we can start explore a little bit the relationship between the intellectual and the experiential with the religious experience. And I would assume that they are both serving, in a sense, at least in my case, both serve to justify what happened to me, to make it that I'm not crazy, that I became a Christian in that light. And perhaps it's a good place to ask Graham a little bit about his view on those things, because he's on record in the literature for saying that in light of the arguments, at least, and perhaps other things, Christians it's rationally permissible to be a Christian. So you correct me if I'm wrong, Graham, right? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're saying that the arguments leave it open, that it's rationally permissible to be either one or the other, a theist or an atheist. And I'm curious if you think that this rational permissibility comes straight from the arguments, or does it come from perhaps a mix of arguments and a conversion story like mine? Would you say that the experience also contributes to make it permissible, that it is not an irrational decision to make? That's sort of a thing. What do you think?
So I think you've characterized my view pretty accurately. So I think that the arguments are just on both sides. Add them up, find the best arguments you can. They're not compelling. So that is, they don't compel people to arrive at a particular position. The arguments just aren't strong enough. I do think, this will speak to part of what you said. I've read quite a few sort of autobiographical sketches by contemporary Christian philosophers. There's a couple of books that came out in the 80s and 90s where lots of philosophers of religion in North America kind of told a little bit of their life story. And it turns out that quite a few of those philosophers claim never to have had a religious experience. Right, they're Christian philosophers, but they kind of regret the fact that they never had anything like Pascal's Night of Fire or even anything sort of remotely like that. And so I'm inclined to think that sort of you don't need the experiential foundation in order for it to be rational for you to be a Christian. The kind of considerations that you might put together as a purely intellectual case, it seems like that can be enough. So the kind of people I've got in mind, I'm pretty sure that Bill Alston was one person, and I suspect maybe that Alvin Plantinga is another. Maybe I'm not remembering the details quite correctly. But I think that he also said that he'd never had anything like that. I mean, of course, religious experience might mean other things. It might mean like going to church and joining in the singing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that's the kind of thing that in the historical record, in the literature, is the kind of thing that might lead sort of pretty directly to conversion, something like that.
Yeah, so in terms of justifying Christian belief, right, on making it rationally permissible, so you're open to saying that the arguments could do some of that, that an experience could do some of that as well, presumably. Like neither sounds like it's strictly necessary, but they could separately justify Christian belief along the lines that you suggest.
Yeah, so I think that you could be a Christian and think that the foundation of your belief really lies in these amazing experiences that you had, or you could be a Christian and think, actually, when I weighed up all of the considerations, my judgment was that this was where the truth lies, and either of those could work.
Yeah, good match.
Yes.
So,
yeah. Well, I'd love. Let's go to a quick break, and we'll come back on this. And I'd love you to spell out maybe just some examples from your own story, Guillaume, of where you feel that the religious experience kind of tallied up with the intellectual journey you were going on, and maybe we can continue to talk about this idea of whether, just what the value is ultimately of religious experience as evidence for God, and ultimately whether being a Christian or any other sort of religion can be a purely intellectual thing, or whether there has to be a sort of experiential element to it. All of these questions will be great to get to as we continue this conversation. We're talking about rationality, religious experience in the case for God, here on The Big Conversation today. My guests are Graham Oppy and Guillaume Bignon. Hey, I hope you're enjoying today's conversation. I'd love to know how you respond. Please click the survey link with the video and tell us what you thought. It's multi-choice and really quick. We've also got a bonus ebook to send you. Bishop Robert Barron and cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor debating God and atheism. You'll receive it when you register for our newsletter, plus you'll get updates and more bonus content from The Big Conversation. Again, the sign-up link and survey are with today's video and at our website, thebigconversation.show. Really interesting discussion today between my guests Guillaume Bignon and Graham Oppy here on The Big Conversation. We're talking about religious experience and Guillaume's book, Confessions of a French Atheist, How God Hijacked My Quest to Disprove the Christian Faith, tells his story, and he's done it in a brief form on today's show as well, of going from atheism to Christianity, both intellectual and experiential kind of story behind that. Give us some more details, Guillaume, of what some of these specific sort of improbabilities were that you feel you're justified in kind of seeing ultimately the hand of God behind, and how that kind of goes hand in hand with the intellectual journey you were on during this.
Yes, sure. So I've kind of given the narrative, so I can just pinpoint them at key points. I think there are some improbabilities that are best interpreted at God's bringing about the fact that he wanted to make me a Christian. So the initial random hitchhiking, the fact that the car stopped to ask for directions, not even to pick us up, and that they were headed towards towards their hotel next door to the house that we were staying at. The fact that then I had my shoulder injury that was really not explained. It's not like I have an accident or anything. Just out of the blue, my shoulder started to hurt on at the practice, and that the doctors couldn't see what was wrong, and that it just said you just need to stop volleyball. That freed me to get to the church on Sunday, and then obviously the experience at the church when trying to escape, that I was stopped in my tracks and I had this big blast of chills, very unusual. That's again best explained by God reaching out and stopping me in my track to send me to the pastor than a pure coincidence, or whatever breakfast I might have in the morning caused something in my stomach. It's a bit difficult to explain. And I'm not saying that Graham should be speculating about what caused this. I'm saying these are some of the improbabilities that I think are quite well explained by God providentially controlling all of this to bring me to faith, and that justify me in this. Obviously, afterwards, there was the relevance of the Christian good news, which met nicely my existential struggle with the timely reactivation of my conscience. And then there's another very improbable thing that happened shortly after my conversion, which is in the move to the United States. For many weeks, the visa were completely frozen at the embassy, and a number, like maybe 15 or so of us that were waiting for visas in my company, were told that there was no status. We couldn't be told anything. We would just have to wait until they tell us the visa are granted. And at that point, I also figured that I needed to start talking about my faith, and that it was one thing that perhaps perhaps God was willing for me to do before I moved to the US. And I took my mom to dinner. This is when I finally told her that I had become a Christian. It was a very nice relief. It was a good experience. And the next day, the visa was granted for me and none of the others who were waiting for the visa in the same situation. Once again, nothing that you cannot dismiss as coincidences, but it's just a very, very visible hand of providence throughout the story that kind of moves it along towards me becoming a Christian and then showing up here in the US.
But are all of those sort of experiences, do you kind of give them that particular interpretation because you're now a Christian, as it were? And so it makes sense. Yes, there's a God. So I now believe that God was behind all of these. Whereas obviously someone from Graham's position who does not believe in God is bound to kind of, in a sense, weigh it differently and say, well, yeah, great that it happened for you, Guillaume, but these things could happen by chance. Let's accept it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't think I'm in a position to use that as to strong arm him and to say, no, look, you absolutely have to believe that Christianity is true in light of those experiences. I think I use them to first, I have several goals in this book. First, entertaining, right? So I think it's a fun story to tell, and I want people to take it to the beach and enjoy just a story of a life completely changed with very fun circumstances. And then I'm trying to also give a compelling account of what God does in the world today to change hearts of people who hate religion and then can be turned around and actually embrace the beauty of the Christian gospel. And obviously present some degree of reasons for why people should become Christians. Now, obviously, I also discuss some of the arguments in the book, and I don't expect Graham to be impressed by my popular level presentation of the arguments for God's existence. He's very familiar with them, and he's very good at pinpointing out which premises he's not going to be accepting as a naturalist. But this is kind of the exercise that I try to do in the book there. But if you take those as simply justifying Christian belief, right, as showing that I didn't lose my mind in the process, that Christian belief is justified, that it's sensible, that even I enjoy good arguments, even if they're not good or successful in the way that Graham would require. All of that, I think, is accomplished by this, and it's probably things that Graham gives me, like the permissibility, the fact that it's justified, that it's sensible, that I'm not crazy in following those things, are all things that I think Graham grants. And so perhaps it's I should cash that check and and run with my winnings and not necessarily go for the $1 million, which would be to perhaps show that atheism is irrational in that light. I don't have a strong incentive to do that with this material, and I'm very happy to simply take what Graham is telling me, which is that, yeah, Christian belief is justified, it's perfectly permissible, and it might be even sensible in light of my experience.
Graham.
Okay, so one thing I'll add to this, which is probably something that you'll be able to just accept as a kind of additional point in your favour, right? It might be that the particular arguments that you give in the book are not ones that are going to be overly impressive to professional philosophers, but you can just reflect that amongst professional philosophers of religion, there are plenty of theists and plenty of atheists, and it's not like somehow or other, if you kind of progressed up a bit further, you'd realise that actually there's super compelling arguments on one side or the other. I mean, it's kind of mysterious, I think, how it could be that you've got really people who've devoted their lives to thinking about the arguments, and they disagree about a whole lot of stuff. If you really thought the arguments were compelling on one side or the other, it would be a complete mystery what's going on with those people. And this is part of the reason why I don't think the arguments are compelling. But it does mean that it kind of doesn't matter. You're right. And so this is kind of for people who are listening as well, right? I mean, if you develop an interest in arguments about the existence of God, you don't have to become Alvin Plantinga or John Mackey in order for it to be worthwhile to think about the arguments. But it does help to recognise that, you know, no matter how high up you go, no matter what level you play this at, right, there's nothing that compels opinion to converge in a particular place.
I mean, you obviously found it compelling yourself, though, Guillaume, and that was because of the confluence, in that sense, of the intellectual journey you'd been on and these experiences you were then having. And to that extent, I mean, do you think that a purely intellectual approach could ever compel anyone. Obviously, Graham feels that ultimately, when you look at it in the cold light of day, neither, arguments for atheism or arguments for theism are compelling. And so, as you've said, it's permissible to simply, hold to one or the other, or presumably be an agnostic somewhere in between. But you obviously, you did feel that there was obviously strength to the intellectual arguments for Christianity, but would that alone have been enough, do you think, or was it really necessary to have this experiential element to it?
Well, in my case, the experiential element was necessary, and that's what brought me over the line. I think that I would be slow to say that it's absolutely necessary for everyone to even come to have at least an intellectual belief that God exists. And it's going to come down to how we parse the arguments. I mean, the various arguments, cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, moral arguments, and all sorts of arguments that Graham discusses in his writings himself, they seek to establish that God exists, and they do so by providing various premises, which, if true, support or entail that God exists. Now, obviously, the job of the atheist philosopher there is going to be saying which are the premises that I don't accept, supposing that the logic is valid. They have to reject a premise. So they say, well, this premise, I'm not convinced. Well, then the argument is going to be moved back, where an additional argument is going to have to be given in favor of that premise, and it's going to have the same sort of structure. Additional premises that, if true, support that premise, and so on. So you follow the premises by additional arguments like this, and I think it's perfectly fine for a person to realize, now we've hit bedrock of something that I thought is true, and I have to follow the arguments to their conclusion, and God exists. That move has been made by very sensible philosophers. We discovered, those premises are true, and now I have to accept the conclusion. Now, Graham goes very far and always can point out one that, no, I'm not committed to. And then we come to considerations of plausibility. Which one do I think is more plausible than the other? And here again, our plausibilities, I think that's a point that Graham makes in his book, in the debate with Kenny Pierce, is going to say plausibility is going to vary with the person, because our commitments, our plausibility structure are educated by our commitments in the first place. So it's possibly that it's the stalemate at which we reach when we go all the way to the bottom of the arguments. I'm convinced that some of them reach some really solidly true premises that are very hard to deny. And Graham obviously disagrees with me because he finds them deniable in light of his worldview commitments. But those arguments serve well if we reach those true premises. And then if they don't, and we are at stalemate on the arguments, then I would say perhaps what's missing is an experience. Graham has not been convinced by those arguments. Perhaps we're waiting for some sort of a divine experience to tip him over the line and take him where the arguments couldn't take him.
There are a lot of arguments on the other side, and there's a case for example, there's a case for naturalism, which I've set out in various of my works, which has lots of bits in it. And the same thing is going to be true about that case as is true for the case for God. Like if I give this case to a theist, they'll trace down, they'll find the premises that I don't like. I can dig further and give arguments for those premises. Eventually, right, we might reach bedrock, and there might be people who are persuaded after all that naturalism is correct. I mean, there's a kind of symmetry in the story at this point. It isn't all a story about the arguments for. And as kind of everybody who's listening will know, there are some arguments that are taken very seriously, that is, some arguments against God that are taken very seriously, having to do with things like evil and divine hiddenness and so on. And theists who are reflecting about this need to think about, okay, in those arguments, which are the premises that I don't like? What am I committing myself to in rejecting those premises, and so on? So that was a small thing that I wanted to add to what Guillaume was saying.
I mean, ultimately, in your experience, Graham, and this is, I guess, a subjective sort of analysis, but do you find that people who are on one side or the other, atheist, theist, or whatever, maybe in academia, maybe in philosophy of religion and so on, have they kind of come to it with a commitment, and then they're kind of looking at the arguments from that perspective? Or I mean, do you ever find anyone who's truly kind of genuinely open to, one or the other and willing to be convinced by the arguments? Or is everyone really coming kind of with the decision made ahead of time, and therefore that's bound to influence, how much weight they're going to give to the cosmological argument or the, whatever argument it may be.
Okay, so one of the interesting questions here is whether you can be a committed agnostic, that is, committed to agnosticism, right? Because there are people who are genuinely agnostic. My younger friend, Joe Schmidt, is an example of somebody who genuinely is an agnostic. I'm not sure, because he's only just finished college, I'm not sure how committed he is to agnosticism, but there are certainly people who are very strongly committed to agnosticism and won't budge. It would be very hard to budge them in either direction. So the question about commitment is, not as straightforward as you might have thought.
Yeah, because you can be committed to agnosticism as much as atheism or theism. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. I mean, what about you, Graham? I mean, I know this makes it personal in that way, but do you feel like you could be persuaded by a really great argument, or would it take some kind of experience that just was somehow undeniable in your personal psychology or whatever to kind of shift you towards theism?
So that's a really difficult question, right? I mean, at this point, people often, think about Hume talking about in the dialogues about the voice in the sky. So people ask, what would it take? And the answer is, I have no idea, right? I mean, I don't see that something like that, a voice that speaks to everybody in their language, right? That's just not in the cards for, our world. Right?
Yeah.
So, and even on most Christian stories, that's not on the cards, right? I'd say.
But if you did have, because this is the interesting thing. Okay, I did a conversation with Peter Atkins, who you may be familiar with, the Oxford chemist, who's a very different kind of atheist to you. Let's put it that way, Graham. And when I asked him what could persuade you, he genuinely struggled to think of anything that could move him from atheism to even slight belief in God, because even something like Jesus appearing to him in a vision in front of him, he said, well, I would just assume my brain had malfunctioned. He was so committed in a sense to naturalism that every kind of experience he ever had that someone else might attribute to God, he said, I would have to assume, my naturalism comes first, something, there's going to be some explanation. I could never consider the divine one in that sense. I mean, now I'm not saying that's your perspective, of course, but I'm saying where's the kind of, where's that point for you at which you would say, yeah, if that happened, I think I'd be pretty convinced that maybe there is a God after all.
So I guess I'm inclined to think about this somewhat differently. I mean, I've read a bit about conversion stories in both directions, and there's all kinds of ways that you can end up being led to change your beliefs and it can be a bit like with Guillaume, accumulation of small things, right, that leads you from one position to another. And I just don't think that we're in a position, like I've been in a position to think about, what would it take? What accumulation of small things would it take to shift me from where I am to somewhere else, to shift me from being atheist to agnostic, say? What would that take? And I really just think that we're not very good at thinking about those kinds of things. We just kind of don't have a very good capacity for answering those questions. I'm not going to go the way that you said that Peter Atkins went, though I do think, given how old I am, that it's kind of unlikely, and how much time I've spent looking at the arguments, it's unlikely that an argument's going to come along. I don't think that we sort of come up with new arguments and sort of devastating new arguments so rapidly that there's going to be an argument that's going to make me change my mind. But even there, of course, that's the epistemic possibility, right? I mean, I say this about all the arguments. When my claim about the kind of lack of persuasiveness of the arguments is also qualified by of all the arguments that we've seen so far.
Yeah. Guillaume, just your thoughts on
I agree that likelihood that something fundamentally new in the arguments is that appears and convinces Graham is low. I think that the probability is fairly low there. What it would take to change his mind, say, given how old I am, I would say, yeah, perhaps it's very improbable. Thankfully, the God that I'm trying to depict in my book is a God that brings about the very improbable. So I'm not losing hope that something might happen. But yeah, apparently my prayers that this show would be cancelled because Graham came with a different opinion has not been fulfilled so far. And as far as bringing about the improbable, I mean, I've hit it on a number of the different pieces of my conversion story that I've very strongly interpreted as God providentially acting like this. I really liked what Ken Pierce said in the book, in conversation with you, Graham, about then looking back and interpreting the ordinary in light of the extraordinary, so that we do come to a plausibility structure where we're able to analyze and interpret correctly even a somewhat natural experience as something that's extraordinary because we've had the extraordinary experience. And he likens it to the scientists who have the extraordinary measurement of quarks and come to the knowledge that this is really what stuff is made of. And then he says, well, now they didn't make that conclusion on the basis of just looking at chairs and tables. They made that with very strong, interesting experiments. But now that they know that, they can look at the normal and saying, well, yeah, this is made of quarks. This is what we know now. And there's a little bit of that in terms of seeing the providence of God. So obviously, Graham takes a very different interpretation of my story, but I am able to see a number of pieces that come together that really speak of providence in light of some of those extremely improbable events that now I'm able on a daily basis to see the hand of God moving and providentially. So it kind of fuels the Christian life in ways that I think are intellectually rational, to simply interpret the normal in light of the extraordinary. And those extraordinary pieces didn't stop at my conversion, right? So there's a number of different fantastic stories of events like this that happened to me afterwards and that continue to fuel a little bit this thirst to see God working in my life. One of which, ironically, happened in connection to this very show, which is that I had not really picked up any hardcore philosophy book in a number of years because my own research interests were more on theology and philosophical theology and researching justification. And so I hadn't really bought philosophy in a few years. And then out of the blue, I became a bit curious and thirsty to order some material. And I went online and ordered Graham's book, Is There a God? And 26 minutes later, I had an invitation in my mailbox to debate Graham Oppy on the existence of God and related questions. So this is, I have the timestamp on my emails. This is really what happened. Now, obviously, great coincidence. You make of it what a naturalist should be making. But I think I can be excused if I see again God's providence in bringing about something really special.
What do you make of that? That's a really interesting story, Guillaume. I mean, Graham, there you go. God using your book to prove his existence in an ironic way. Okay. So Guillaume says, look, for me, it makes sense for me to interpret, me ordering your book and then Justin completely out of the blue, inviting me to come on the show with you, 26 minutes later. That for Guillaume is a sign of that there's a God doing stuff behind the scenes. Now, so what do you do with that, Graham? Do you think Guillaume should be more skeptical of these experiences, or is he kind of justified because he does believe in God in, as he says, interpreting ordinary things in extraordinary ways because he believes there is actually something rather extraordinary going on behind the scenes?
So I'm curious to know what he thinks about my story, because if I tell the story in more detail, there's quite a lot of coincidences that are required in order for me to end up being an atheist philosopher of religion. And so Guillaume might see the hand of divine providence in that, but if there is the kind of hand of divine providence there, it's working in a fairly curious kind of way, I think.
Yeah, and here there's a couple of options for me. The first one is to punt to mystery and saying that God has morally sufficient reasons to allow this great evil to have happened to you, that you became the flag bearer for the opposition. Or I can simply say that okay, this is going to make it even more glorious when God converts you, and we can announce to the world that Graham Oppy has become a Christian.
Right, but suppose that seems kind of
like
likely to me. I go on being an atheist until I die. I mean, of course, there are things you can say. There's kind of post-mortem, from your point of view, there's post-mortem conversions probably. So, you might have a story, but it's hard to see from your point of view what great good I'm bringing to the world.
Yeah, so I don't have a very strong explanation for what justifies the God in his ways of this, and it gets into some very classical debates of Christian philosophy and theology itself on the nature of God's providence over human free will. We do have a God in the Bible who says he will have mercy on who he has mercy and compassion on who he has compassion. So I happen to take the Calvinist view on those matters, so it seems consistent to me that God would not try his hardest to get every single person to become a Christian. It seems to me that he has morally sufficient reasons for why he saves some and not others, but it certainly raises puzzles that I do try to address in my work on free will and divine providence.
I mean, for you, is this a sort of a problem then, that if there is a God, we should be seeing more people be having these experiences like Guillaume? Graham, is there a kind of probabilistic thing here that, well, if there was a God behind this whole show? I mean, do sometimes I know people, when it comes to religious experience, have another objection, which is, well, lots of people in lots of different traditions have religious experiences. So, is that God or but not all of these different religions can be true at the same time. I mean, are those the kind of concerns you have as well?
So I think that the second kind of concern is much more interesting to me. The diversity of religious experience and the diversity of interpretations that are put upon religious experience makes it quite difficult to see the evidential value of testimony to religious experience. Once you know about the kind of history of this testimony and how specific it is, you don't find people in Australia in 1700 testifying to the existence of Jesus, right? And nor do you find them. We don't have kind of oral history coming down to us of people having experiences that we would now interpret as being experiences of Jesus. They may have stuff to say about experiences connected to the ancestors and the rainbow serpent, but that's what you get, right? And that the point there is not that you couldn't tell some story. So in the book, with the debate book with Kenny Pierce tries to make a case that what's going on there is that those people are actually having experiences of the Christian God. It's just that they don't realise that they are. And I argue that doesn't sound really very plausible to me when you think about the details about the rainbow serpent. But we could go backwards and forwards.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. I mean, what do you say to that particular objection, which obviously for Graham is disconfirmatory of the Christian view, because people do have very varied religious experiences, and there are people who have never heard of Jesus and never do, and have completely different sort of conceptions of God and so on. Guillaume,
I think I'm not sure I'm going to put all of my weight on Kenny Pierce's answer, but there is something that is strikingly convincing in there, which is that he doesn't have to have an explicitly Christian framework for every single religious experience that he claims serves to establish God's existence, that they at least serve to undermine naturalism, and then he should have some sort of a theological explanation for why that's in a strange context, or why the people are making wrong interpretations or wrong claims about their experience. And then there are some experiences that he will have to dismiss. I mean, I thought it was hilarious when you brought what you call that cephalonomancy, I think it's on page 234, where people are boiling animals. And you said, and I quote, "I say that boiling a donkey's head is not a reliable way of gaining knowledge of the future." I thought it was a hilarious line. I'm fully with you on this one. And this is a claim of a religious experience, and I do agree that as a Christian, we do have to dismiss this as not authentic, right? So it's not like it's a true experience of God, but wrongly interpreted. I think that no, this is actually incorrect, and we stand with the naturalist in our interpretation of that one. But I don't think that this is special pleading for the Christian to say that no, this experience is no good. Mine is actually reliable, and I can conclude that God exists on that basis. It's just going to be a different experience. Now, mind you, if the person boiling that donkey's head turned out to make incredibly accurate prophecies every single time he did that, then I might have to rethink what's going on with the donkey here. But until it does, I think that it's okay to maintain differences across the various religious contexts and saying, no, but probably my experience is, I have not seen anything that convinces me my experience is either delusory or misinterpreted. And so I stand by what I've experienced. It seems like the God of the Bible has reached out to me.
Let's go to a quick break and we'll see what Graham has to say in response to that in just a moment's time. Guillaume Bignon and Graham Oppy joining me on the show today. Rationality, religious experience, and the case for God. We'll be back with the big conversation in just a moment. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. Welcome back to the show. We were talking about religious experience. Guillaume Bignon had a really interesting conversion from atheism as a French atheist to being a Christian, now lives in the States, is a theologian and philosopher. Graham Oppy is an atheist, a well-known philosopher of religion, but has never had any particular experience that has sort of wanted to make him change his mind on that. He's never met an argument that would particularly convince him of theism either. But we're having an interesting discussion on sort of what value, what evidence we can place on religious experience specifically on today's show. Did you want to come back to what Guillaume was saying in that last segment, to do with boiling donkeys' heads and whether, these religious claims, are evidence for something? What did you want to say, Graham?
So I just wanted to make a point about how astonishingly diverse and vast the range of divination practices actually is. And it's not just that Guillaume is going to agree with me about the boiling of donkeys' heads. He's going to agree with me almost right across the board that about sort of attempts to define what God or the gods want, to divine what the gods or the God or the gods want, are going to be mistaken from his point of view, and he's going to dismiss them on more or less the grounds that I'm going to dismiss them, but he may make a kind of exception. I expect he will for maybe it's not exactly divination, but for certain things to do with prophecies and miracles associated with the Christian religion. And from a naturalist point of view, that's kind of going to look like special pleading, because you have this nice uniform account of everybody else except for yourself, right? And then the naturalist says, we'll just extend it to you as well.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that one, Guillaume? Because if you're going to discount the Mormons and the Muslims and the Buddhists and everyone who's got their their claimed prophecies and religious experiences and everything else, but say but the Christian story, those are all true. Yeah, is it special pleading?
Yeah, it's going to be special pleading if we don't take into account the reasons. I think it's going to boil down to this to justify this. So obviously there are quite a bit of experiences that I currently have to dismiss in principle because I don't have the specifics, right? So when I'm hearing of the donkey boiling head and predicting the future there, I don't have any specifics. So I have to say, well, it doesn't sound right. I really don't think that's really accurate. But it's good. For me to be accused of special pleading, I would need to have zero or equal reasons across the board, and then I pick one that I prefer and say, no, this one is good, but I don't have any better reasons. I think I'm in a position to say that I have better reasons for Christianity, for Christian belief, and for interpreting my own story as genuinely experiencing the living God than I do about the boiling of the donkey's head. So it's going to come down to an exercise in comparing reasons, and I suspect that my view is going to come out on top, but admittedly, I don't have all of this data in front of me that I can compare and say, I'm just going to say, I'm not engaging in special pleading. I think it's going to boil down to the reasons there.
So there are some religious traditions that clearly are rivals to Christianity in their breadth, scope, depth, and so on. So do you think that you would have had to have looked really carefully into, say, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on, in order to be justified in dismissing all of them?
I don't know. I think that the presence of religious experience, or at least claims of religious experience in those other traditions, doesn't have to be exclusively dismissed as being inauthentic, right? So, I mean, I don't need, like, God can reveal himself in all sorts of contexts, some of which might be non-Christians, and yet without thereby affirming the religion. So if I think of my friend Nabil Qureshi, who was a former Muslim who became a Christian, he tells this story in the book in format and tone very much like mine, of explaining his conversion story and using it to pepper it with apologetic discussions of Christianity versus Islam. He clearly tells of stories that are very providential in the same nature, of very improbable events that God seemingly orchestrates from the time he was young, where he was clearly in the Muslim context, and in which case he concluded that, yeah, God exists and that he's there and that he cares for his life. And I don't need, as a Christian, to dismiss that as being genuinely God revealing himself to Nabil in his young age. But then I follow his story, and he turns out to become a Christian again, with series of visions and dreams and various intellectual conversations mixed in. So similar ingredients to my conversion story happening in a Muslim context, and yet, in my view, by my lights, supporting the Christian understanding of God in all this.
But of course, there are conversion stories that go the other way as well. So that raises a question about kind of the evidential value of the now, whether you can really claim that Muslim religious experience supports Christianity, right, is going to be kind of tricky. People who've gone the other way going to, if you were going to make that move, would just make the reverse move, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not aware of a very strong story of conversion from Christianity to Islam that involves some very improbable events that I'd be hard pressed to dismiss as coincidental. Now, again, the cynical is going to say, well, who gets to decide what's coincidental and what's not? But I think that the probabilities can be compared, and clearly in the experiential context, I think I'm justified in my interpretation as it stands.
I mean, if you have got, say, a Muslim and a Christian, and they both have very powerful experiences that led them to their particular faith position, Guillaume, I mean, at that point, to kind of decide, well, has one or the other got the right, do you then have to go to the intellectual argument and say, well, does Christianity seem to make more sense as an intellectual option, or is Islam? I mean, is that the kind of the decider at that point between two perhaps equally convincing religious experiences as far as the converts are concerned?
That's one very possible route, yes. That then we can compare notes on the solidness, on the strength of the historical evidence that we might have. So it's now a conversation where the naturalist is not necessarily taking a party or one over the other, but Nabil in his conversion story, in conversations with David Wood, went back and forth quite a bit discussing the historical reliability of the New Testament, of the Quran, and the sources surrounding Muhammad and Jesus, and ultimately wrestling with the argument in favor of the resurrection of Jesus. That all of this came piling in, and it seems, I mean, again, what else am I going to say as a Christian? But it seems to me that the evidence is much more strongly present in the Christian faith than it is on the Muslim view. That's going to be the intellectual refereeing that you can engage in if the purely experience seems to be on the par, which I still don't think it is.
Presumably, though, Graham, you would have trouble ever accepting that there is enough sort of evidence from the Christian sort of historical sort of perspective to kind of get you to that kind of
well,
place.
There's an interesting question here about the kind of comparative evidence for Christianity and for Islam, right? There's and a lot of it, I assume, the scholarly debate about the reliability of the Hadith and the kind of how much weight you should put in the kind of chains of authentication for the various sayings of the Prophet. is going to be very hard to assess as a non-expert, as someone who doesn't speak Arabic, because I don't, and so on. So I don't think that it's going to be at all straightforward to weigh the sort of strength of the historical cases for Islam and Christianity. I mean, just to make one point, there are sort of the existence of Muhammad is kind of testified in sources when he was alive, right? So there's a kind of difference there straight off, that there's very little. I mean, of course, people who don't accept Islam are skeptical about the story about how Muhammad got the Quran, right? The kind of visitation from the archangel and so on. But in terms of the kind of historical stuff and the archaeological evidence, there's a lot of and partly this is just a function of recency. We know a lot more about the rise of Islam and about what Islamic culture was about immediately after Muhammad than we know about Christian culture in the first 150 years after the death of Christ, right? So it's going to be hard to, I mean, depending what you're trying to authenticate, it's going to be hard to argue that the historical evidence for Christianity is stronger than the historical evidence for Islam.
Yeah, so I'm trying to see if I want to get into a debate on Islam versus Christianity with Graham Oppy. Maybe he's not the right person and I'm not the right person either.
Yeah.
Maybe you want David Wood to defend Christianity against Islam. But no, from the popular level apologetic material that I consume, certainly, and that, I'm friends with people who research this very seriously, the historical evidence for Christianity is really much superior to that of Islam in terms of the quality of the sources, the number of the documents, the historical reliability of the things that we find in the New Testament, that they get the geography right, the names right. So the reliability of the New Testament is very well attested. I recommend the work of Peter J. Williams on this. He's done some really solid work on defending the reliability of the Gospels on historical grounds. You find nothing of the sort for the reliability of the Quran. And as far as explaining the experience of Muhammad getting the Quran, I think that the Christian doesn't even have to explain it along naturalist terms. I think that the Islamic sources themselves say that Muhammad himself thought that it was demonic as an experience, and then he was later on convinced that no, actually this was the Archangel Gabriel. So there's options there to interpret, but the reliability of the sources from comparing those, to take the word that you've used, I don't think it's straightforward, but I think that a careful examination of the sources gives Christianity clearly on top.
I think I'll go back to the thing that you said at the beginning. Probably it will be dangerous for us to try to explore this question further. But maybe that will also apply then, because to the question about whether and why there might be more historical documents relating to Christianity than there are to Islam. Because one of the things that really kind of matters is the dating of the documents. There are lots of copies that were made in 600 AD of documents that were written earlier, is largely a function, and that there aren't for, pagan documents of various kinds, is largely a function of Christian dominance, which means the Christians were very concerned to preserve their own documents. They were not particularly concerned to preserve all kinds of pagan documents, and in some cases they were actually kind of concerned to destroy them, right? So the argument from sort of weight of documentation is actually not that compelling as just putting it in a kind of general form.
Well, I'm not using the number of sources as a reason to think that, oh, look at that, God must have miraculously preserved this information. However we explain the presence of the wealth of those documents one way or another doesn't really matter to the fact that there are lots of documents that therefore allow us to have a good, reliable account of what they at least believed. Now, obviously, just because they write it down doesn't mean that it's true. But in terms of accessing what was claimed, what is the historical account that is made, I think the wealth of sources speaks for itself, regardless of how we explain how we got to have that number of documents.
So that's right. The question about the reliability of the sources is something else, and maybe we just won't go there.
We may not have time to open up that particular whole conversation. We've done it though in the past. I can recommend some great other big conversations between someone you just mentioned, Guillaume, Peter J. Williams and Bart Ehrman, where they really dig into those kinds of questions around the reliability of the New Testament documents. But that's all available in our archives, obviously. It's just been a really interesting conversation, though. Thank you so much for the back and forth, Graham, on this whole question of religious experience and so on. I mean, ultimately, Graham, you know, it strikes me that you're not the kind of atheist who says Christians who claim religious experiences or, you know, hold to their faith are crazy, deluded, whatever. You see that if it makes sense for you, it makes sense for you, and if it doesn't make sense for you, it doesn't make sense for you. I mean, ultimately, here's a cheeky question to finish off with. I mean, would you be interested to be proved wrong? Would you sort of, you know, if it turned out, you know, when you do meet the end, you did meet your maker, would that be a pleasant surprise or a not so pleasant surprise?
I guess that depends how it turns out, if that's the way it goes, right? And that seems quite unclear to me too, right? So there are very different, what will I call them? Different sets of views within Christianity. So Guillaume mentioned before that he's a Calvinist, but if you ask certain kinds of Anglicans, you'll get a very different kind of story about, you know, so for a start, universalism is a view that's common across a range of, I don't know what to call them, Christian denominations, but not others, right? So, you know, and maybe, you know, I'll be looked upon very favourably by the Christian God. Who knows?
Well, Guillaume, any final thoughts as we close out today?
Well, yeah, maybe I need to get back to that claim that I should be cashing my winnings, given what Graham has given me, that he was in print, so it's like I already had this before we started this conversation, but he does grant the rationality of Christian belief, that can be justified on the basis of the arguments and of my religious experience. So in that sense, he's not like the French atheist philosophers that I interact with in great part in my book as well, the Michel Onfray, the Baron d'Holbach, the Jean Méliès, who all decry the irrationality of Christian belief. So Graham gives us that religious experience justifies belief here in our case. And then there's the evidential value of my experience that is raised, like what does it accomplish? I don't want to say that I can strong-arm anybody with my experience to say, well, now, therefore, you ought to be a Christian, but perhaps more modestly, I want to say that this is an invitation, right? So that's kind of what I try to do with my book, telling the story. I'm saying, look, this happened to me, and this is an open invitation for you to try and reach out and see if God knows how to catch you in the way that he thought to catch me.
Well, thank you both for a really interesting conversation today. I'll make sure there are links to both of my guests, Guillaume and Graham, where you can find their books as well with today's show. Do make sure to check those out, and you can continue reading and investigating the arguments on both sides. But for now, thank you very much, Guillaume and Graham, for
joining me. With a real
me.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
Well, thank you for watching today. I'd love to know what you made of Graham and Guillaume's conversation on religious experience. Please click the survey link with the video and tell us what you thought. It's multi-choice and really quick. We've also got a bonus ebook to send you. Bishop Robert Barron and cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor debating God and atheism. You'll receive it when you register for our newsletter, plus you'll get updates and more bonus content from The Big Conversation. The sign up and survey links are with today's show and at our website, thebigconversation.show.